It's great to be here with you all. This is the second program I think we've done that the moderator is here in the National World War II Museum. We're delighted to be able to continue to bring our members, our friends, and all of our audience around the world these wonderful, insightful programs, despite not doing these in public, in person quite yet. 75 years ago, an American capital ship was sailing on what would eventually be her final mission. And we are delighted to have two wonderful individuals who have really dug deep into this and done they've accomplished something unique where a relatively well-known story in World War II history is written on, and there is a lot of information in this book on the USS Indianapolis. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to recognize, I know we have a lot of folks watching. This is the 75th anniversary, and the members of the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization, as well as the USS Indianapolis Legacy Organization. I know that you guys are there who are tuning in addition to all of our regulars and friends. So thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, we are joined by two co-authors, Lynn, Vincent, and Sara Vladic. Lynn is a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 11 nonfiction works. She is a veteran journalist and author of over 1,000 articles. I don't know how many that breaks down per week or per month, but that's a lot. And they have been featured in many of the major media outlets, including Newsweek and The New Yorker. Sara Vladic is an acclaimed documentarian, and she came about this through the way that many of us do. She got an early passion in her early teens for the story of World War II, specifically the USS Indianapolis. And over 2 decades, she has interviewed over 100 of the survivors of the USS Indianapolis. That features prominently in the book. And before we get into the conversation about the book, we wanted to share with you the trailer that was put together for books. Many of you probably only know trailers for movies, but it's a new thing that publishers have been doing for a couple of years. And it's really well done. And I think the highlight is actually hearing some of the veterans in their own voices. So if we can run that trailer, then we'll get started on the conversation.
I started into the Navy when I was 16, and I saw all 10 battles.
I saw the flag raised out in Sarabachi.
I personally helped load and unload components of the atomic bomb.
On the 30th of July, we were hit by 2 torpedoes from a submarine and sunk.
The next thing I know, the ship's going right out from under me.
I never did know how to swim, and the Navy never taught me how to swim.
And here's all these sharks going around. Come right across your legs like that.
It was chaos.
We couldn't understand why we weren't rescued.
A lot of them lost the will to live.
Us guys decided, well, hell, this is where we're going to die.
Then there on that 4th day, I said, I hear a plane. And we began to splash water. We began to yell. We began to pray. Everything. And seemingly when he got to a point that had he gone any further, he would have gone over. But you know what he did? He made a dive.
How did I make it with nothing to eat, no water to drink, no sleep for 5 nights? Tell them the Lord was with me.
If somebody wrote this up as fiction, nobody would believe it happened.
People don't realize the politics in the armed forces.
All the headlines were about the captain being court-martialed.
Many a head should have rolled before they ever got to the captain.
It's the story that's not been told. Those don't want to remember. They don't want to recall. It's too much. But I'm a dummy. I think it ought to be told.
Well, great. Ladies, let's jump right into it. The story of the Indianapolis is, as I mentioned, one that is better known because of her tragic ending. but could you let the audience know what makes your book different?
I'll start. So, you know, with this story, aside from, we really wanted to capture the whole story of Indianapolis, but in order to do that initially, I felt I had to talk to the guys who lived and served aboard her. So those who served prior to the final sailing, those who served during the final sailing, I really wanted to get to know them. And that involved many years of interviews, and they actually became kind of like grandparents. And so hearing their stories and being able to bring that personal touch allowed us to put us in the shoes of the sailors walking on the deck of Indianapolis and bring it to life in a way that maybe other authors before didn't quite have that time and the ability to build that kind of relationship. But you know, you're on the deck with these guys as they walk upon it for the first time ever. And prior to that, the biggest thing they'd ever seen was a tractor. You know, they're from middle America farms, they're teenagers, and they're walking aboard Indy, or they have a sweetheart at home and they're writing her letters, and we got to read those letters and we got to incorporate that in the personal relationships, the home front story. And so when we're going to these battles that we've heard of, the Okinawa, Iwo Jima, we're seeing it through the lens of these young men who lived it. And I think that allowed us to tell a really personal side of Indianapolis that maybe others hadn't had the chance to do before us.
And another thing that separates our book from some of the others is the fact that more time had passed. Some authors who've written about this choose to focus on the time in the water, others choose to focus on the court-martial. And so we wanted to tell an end-to-end story. And one of the pieces that we told that hadn't been told, I don't think anywhere before, was about the transport of the atomic bomb. And the way we were able to tell that is in our travels by going to, where did we get that? At the Library of Congress. We found the personal papers of Major Robert Furman, who was the head of intelligence for the Manhattan Project. And he had all of these handwritten notes talking about his time aboard the ship. And most of the time when you read about the transport of the atomic bomb, you're reading maybe a paragraph or two, but we were so fortunate to be able to tell this whole story about Major Furman and his partner, Captain James Nolan. So that's a difference. Another difference is, as Sara said, being able to go into the individual lives of the sailors and kind of get in their heads. And then finally, the exoneration story. That was something that hadn't been told before. And we're really fortunate to be good friends with Captain Bill Tody, who was the skipper of the namesake submarine, USS Indianapolis. And so he was able to share the behind the scenes story, the backroom deals in Congress, and also we were able to share the story of young Hunter Scott, a 12-year-old boy who was instrumental in the exoneration.
The atomic bomb, the sinking, these are the well-known parts. But you ladies go into the whole story of the Indy, which admittedly, until I read your book when it came out a couple of years ago, I did not know how illustrious her career was. You open the book by really capturing the reader's attention, and one would think that that story you open with would be about the sinking or the survivors staying afloat. But could you tell us about the action that you selected, and why did you go with that?
We start with Indianapolis being offshore of Japan. And what we wanted to do was show that Indianapolis is more than a sinking story and more than a shark story. We wanted to show this valorous ship in action right at the end of the war. And so by doing that, by starting off the coast of Kyushu, Japan, with Indianapolis actually in battle action, it gave us a chance to introduce readers to some things that they might not know about the Indianapolis story, such as the fact that she was the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. I don't think a lot of people really know that. And the fact that the most of the westward march from Hawaii to Japan was planned and executed from her decks by Admiral Spruance. Also, we got a chance to talk about her 10 battle stars, ending when we enter the story, she's just left Iwo Jima and the fighting is still going on there, and is now headed for Okinawa. And the reason that we wanted to start at Okinawa is because it was an incident at Okinawa that actually put her in a position to be the ship that carried the bomb. If she hadn't been hit by a kamikaze off the coast of Okinawa, there's a very good possibility that Indianapolis would have wound out the war as the victorious flagship of the Pacific Fleet. But as it was, she was struck on the night before, or the day before Easter in 1945, and 9 men were killed and a couple of dozen were injured. And the damage was so bad that she had to go back to Mare Island, California for repairs. And it was because of that, that when the Navy needed the bomb to be transported, she was available.
Sara, do you have?
I was gonna say, I think Lynn covered that one pretty well.
Let's start with Sara on this one. Obviously, the kamikaze attack at Okinawa was not a highlight, but it was one of the key actions of her life. Are there other facts you'd like to share, other highlights, other key points?
Well, like Lynn mentioned, a lot of times it's overlooked that, you know, she was President Roosevelt's ship of state. She was one of the first ships to take the president out of the country, an acting president out of the country, on a goodwill tour to South America. And so Roosevelt took his son aboard the ship, and they did this, it was a couple months long where they went on this tour. It was also said that she was one of his favorite ships. And so he actually learned about the kamikaze attack about that happened aboard Indianapolis days before he passed away. He was informed of this. And so, you know, this was an important ship. This was a ship everybody knew. And also, you know, as Lynn also mentioned, it was the ship of state for the flagship of the Fifth Fleet for Admiral Spruance. And so, you know, the guys were very proud to be on this ship. And, you know, when she went and participated in these battles, everyone knew when Indianapolis was there. You know, the guys talk about the attacks that they witnessed. And again, these are teenagers. Many of them are teenagers. And so them, you know, being on these decks, watching these massive attacks that, you know, they still hold with them to this day, you know, whether it was watching Saipan, watching, you know, Tinian, Battle of Philippine Sea. These were all major battles, and she was at the forefront of these battles, and rarely do people know that. So that was, again, part of what we wanted to do, was really bring that to life and tell what she was involved in, how important she was to the fleet. And in fact, Spruance was waiting for her to return to the Philippines so he could go back aboard Indianapolis in the last days of war. When they were going to do the invasion of Japan, he was planning to do this from the deck of Indianapolis.
The summer of 45, obviously, as I mentioned, tomorrow marks the 75th. One of our questions, I'm going to interject here. Kim points out that due to the international dateline and time zone adjustments, we are now actually in the 75th from when the action took place. Americans and calendars don't quite understand the international dateline as well as Kim does. But can you tell us about this mission? Obviously, the kamikaze attack sent her back to Mare Island. And how was she selected? Was it just happenstance that she was there? Was there a protective aspect that she was this large capital ship? What went into that? And tell us about the mission to deliver these critical components.
Those are great questions. She was available, as I mentioned, only because she had so much battle damage that she had to go back to Mare Island. And concurrently, maybe some folks don't know this, President Truman wasn't yet sure that he was going to use atomic weapons to end the war. He was, you know, journaling about it. He was consulting with his advisors about it. And as a Christian, he was praying about it. I mean, this was a huge, monumental decision as to whether to do this. And what it came down to for him was projected death tolls of an atomic attack versus a homeland invasion of Japan. And so the death toll of the homeland invasion, the projections far outweighed the use of the bomb. Also, 250,000 people had just been killed at Okinawa, including up to 140,000 civilians. So these were all the things that went into the mix in terms of that. But what is interesting is they sent the bomb to Tinian Island aboard Indianapolis before they even were sure that they were going to use it. As a matter of fact, the bomb was loaded at Mare Island on the same day as the Trinity test. And Major Furman was already underway and out of communication when the Trinity test took place. So he didn't even know it was successful as Indianapolis steamed to Hawaii. Now at Mare Island, what they did was they had a big crate and they made a big show of loading that onto Indianapolis and putting it on the hangar deck. And that was what the crew's attention was focused on. No one on the ship, including the captain, knew what was in the big box. Well, what was in the big box was a bunch of unclassified stuff. The core of the bomb that would become known as Little Boy was actually carried aboard Indianapolis in 2 buckets that almost looked like the size of ice cream freezers, as Major Furman described it in those papers that I mentioned. And so while all of the sailors and the Marines aboard Indianapolis were looking at that box on the hangar bay, in the hangar bay going, what is it? What is it? We know it's a secret. They didn't know that the actual thing they should have been concerned about was carried secretly aboard in these buckets. So on July 16th, 1945, they take off over toward Hawaii and they make a record speed run that still stands today for this class of ship. 74.5 hours, and then they're off to Tinian after a brief refueling stop.
I'd like to add the personal part of this is one of my favorite parts of the story is, you know, the young sailor, they were young when this happened and they still convey this to this day, but there was this enormous curiosity about what was in that crate, like Lynn had mentioned, and this was a very well made. It wasn't just slapped together boards. It was, you know, the set screws and there were wax on the seams and very nice wood. And so Marine Guard Sergeant Edgar Harrell, who is still with us today, and hi Ed if you're out there, but you know, he would tell us about all these curious sailors that would come up and try to get close to the crate and try to, you know, distract the Marines or try to get the Marines to tell them what was in it. And they were no nonsense. You know, this unit of 39 Marines had a job, and that was to guard the bomb, and they were not taking any funny business. But it didn't stop the sailors from being curious or taking bets. And so they had, you know, they were wagering everything from, you know, Rita Hayworth's undergarments to, what was it? A car for Douglas MacArthur to, you know, Glenn Morgan had said he thought it was plans on how to end the war. And, you know, they kind of joked, none of them even got anywhere near guessing what was actually in it. There was a young ensign on board. He'd just been on board for less than a month, actually, by the name of John Woolston. And he said, and John was the junior damage control officer and very matter of fact, very to the point. And he said, well, I read a Time magazine article about uranium and the use, and I put the pieces together and I knew what was in there, but a junior officer doesn't go and question people, so I didn't ask. And so, you know, John, you were right. But yeah, he says that was part of the journey with, and he always wished he would have asked what was in there or questioned them or pushed them to answer, but he didn't. So he told us, quote, in the end, I just didn't have the guts.
Well, we know these men had plenty of guts, and they needed them for the hell that awaited them. After they deliver the components, and I believe Furman's delivered there too, right, to the Marianas. How long did they stay? What was their? There's no leave in the Marianas really, but what did they do before they set sail for a final time?
Well, when they dropped the bomb at Tinian, you're right. They also dropped off Major Furman and Captain Nolan. And we recently learned they dropped off another crew member, which we didn't know until this year. So that was one lucky guy. But then they sailed south to Guam. And that's where the stage was set for the disaster, because when they got to Guam, one thing that I forgot to mention is that they had 1/3 turnover of new crew when they were at Mare Island. So Captain McVeigh, the skipper, kept going, oh gosh, I need to train up this new crew. I need to train up this new crew. But because they were picked on such short notice for this mission, a lot of these men had been on board. They had literally been sailors for 2 weeks. And so McVeigh was very anxious to get this refresher training for his crew, and it kept getting delayed and delayed. So now they're at Guam, and he's like, okay, finally, we can sail 1,200 miles west to Japan and, to the Philippines. And when we get there, we'll get our refresher training. So he goes to make his sailing plans, and he's told a couple of things. He's told by the man who should have had intelligence otherwise that this route, which was known as Route Petty, was very safe. And he literally said, the Japanese are on their last legs. There's nothing to worry about. And then at the routing office, they gave him a speed of advance that was commensurate with the idea that it was safe. Because if there were submarines, if there was a threat of submarines, they would have given him a very fast speed, because a cruiser can outrun a sub. So they gave him 15.7 knots. They gave him an intelligence report that omitted the fact that they had intelligence that there was a quartet of 4 Japanese attack submarines, including the I-58, that were headed down to operate off the Marianas. So they didn't tell Captain McVeigh that. And so on July 28th, 1945, they set sail, and it was just supposed to be this routine steam across the Philippine Sea. They gave the guys, freedom. We call it rope yarn. I'm a Navy vet. We call it rope yarn in the Navy, meaning, you just find a book, settle down, take it easy. The smoking lamp was lit, have a cigarette. That's how secure they felt with the intelligence that they'd been given. But then just before midnight on July 30th, what would have become July 30th, I-58, the submarine I mentioned, popped up in the middle of the Philippine Sea. And that submarine was commanded by Mochitsuru Hashimoto, a lieutenant commander. I'll let you take it, Sara.
Sara, do you have?
What would you like? Would you like to go into the sinking story? Or?
Yeah. I wanted to know both from the personal account, but also the macro story of the sinking of I-58 and how the attack came. Did the men on board even know this was happening? Was she just struck out of nowhere? So please go into some detail on that.
Sure. So as Lynn mentioned, it was just after midnight. So that had been a change of shifts. Some men were getting ready for bed. Some men were just getting on duty. It was a very, very dark night. The moon was totally covered. It was a very cloudy night. The captain had given the orders, or had allowed that they had the choice, the discretion of whether or not to zigzag. And zigzagging was a maneuver that was used for Japanese submarine evasion. But by this point in the war, when the Japanese would attack, they were well aware of this tactic and took account for it. So, this is just after midnight. The ship is not zigzagging, it's on a straight path. And just when Commander Hashimoto surfaces, he surfaces to take a look around, he spots Indianapolis because the light came, the clouds broke and the light from the moon shone down, and there's Indianapolis right in their path. And, he calls to his crew, prepare torpedoes, and with it, and he's watching the ship and he's realizing it's coming right for him. And so he fires a spread of 6 torpedoes, and 2 of which hit the ship. The men did not see it coming. There was no warning. They had no idea there was any enemy in the water. And so the ones that were sleeping, in the forward part of the deck, when the first torpedo hit, it tore off the bow of the ship at the 12th frame. And that was where many of the sleeping quarters were for the sailors, for the enlisted, for the stewards. What else? officers' quarters were also in the forward part of the ship. So they were killed instantly. And this left a gaping hole. It was like the maw of a mouth, you know, pushing forward with an open, just a passageway to all the bulkheads, and water just is pushing through. And the second torpedo hit almost immediately afterwards and hit right under the main stack. And it hit the ammunition stores and blew through the ship. And that second torpedo took out sick bay, dental quarters, and another portion of where many of the crew members were, but it also took out the communications and it took out the power. So on the bridge, they're seeing that the front of the ship is gone. You know, it's dangling there by some steel and just serving as a rudder. And they can't communicate to the engine room to stop engines. The engine room thinks, well, there's an enemy out there, let's get out of here. And they keep pushing forward. So that just pushes the water through even faster. And the men are doing everything they can to try to ballast the ship. The engine room even releases all the very thick oil into the water to try to ballast the ship. And as the ship is going forward, it starts to list. And eventually it goes all the way to her side before her tail lifts straight up into the sky. And, you know, this is a 610-foot long ship. So this is like 5 stories that are still in the sky, slowly going down into the water. And all this happens from the time they're hit to the time Indianapolis disappears from the face of this earth, 12 minutes. So we've been talking way longer than that, and the ship was gone. And suddenly these men who were sleeping 12 minutes earlier, most in their skivvies or their underwear or nothing at all, and now they're swimming in the middle of the Pacific, and they've been spread out. So some of them started abandoning ship almost immediately because they were near the bow and they could see the damage. Others were near the fantail and had to jump. You know, Adolfo Celaya, survivor, talks about, you know, jumping multiple stories from the fantail of the ship in order to abandon ship. So these men are spread out over a mile at this point. And some of them have congregated in groups. Some of them, there are a few lucky ones, about 30 men total, who got on the rafts that were able to make it off the ship. But in general, most of these men were swimming with life jackets or nothing at all in the middle of a pitch black ocean, midnight, and no land within like 300 miles. So they don't even know what hit them, literally. And there they are wondering what happened.
And Jeremy, at that point, nobody knew they were missing because, as Sara mentioned, the power outage, not only did the power internally to the ship cut off communications, but even though they were sending out distress signals, no one heard them.
I hesitate to get into numbers because each number represents an individual human life with loved ones, friends, people that will never see them again. But can you tell us what the complement of the ship was, how many were killed with the initial attack and sinking, and how many survivors there were about 15 minutes past midnight on the 30th?
The crew was 1,195, including one very unfortunate passenger who caught a ride. His name was Captain Crouch, and he was buddies with Captain McVeigh, and he was gonna fly from Guam to the Philippines, but he decided to catch a ride with Indianapolis instead, and he didn't make it. So there were 1,195, including him, and it's estimated, no one really knows this for sure, but it was estimated that 300 men went down with the ship, and then about, a little under 900 went into the water alive. It's also estimated that about 100 men died before the sun rose. And so when the sun did rise, there were several large groups as well as individual floaters, as we call them. But the largest group was about 400 men, and the entire amount of survival gear that they had was a 100-foot line, a rope, basically. And there were several heroes in that group. One of them was Captain Edwin Park, who actually, there's some memorial stuff here in San Diego to him at the Marine Corps base here. But he began gathering this group of 400 men into a ring, and they put the most injured men in the center, in the center of the ring, and everybody else was supposed to hold on to this line. And so that was the largest group. The ship's chaplain, Father Conway, was in that group, and both of the ship's doctors were in that group, Lieutenant Commander Haynes and Lieutenant Modisher. And then I think the next largest group, Sara, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the Redmayne group with about 175?
About 200.
About 200. And then there was another large group that also had a floater net. They were 160 something. And then there were a whole bunch of smaller groups. And so, as Sara said, these men were spread out over a mile, but over the course of the next 5 nights and 4 days, they would spread out for something like 25 miles. Is that correct? Yeah.
Sara, we're all fortunate to live in a time where we can still interact with World War II veterans. Some of us engage more than others. You certainly have, by interviewing as many of the survivors as you can. Were they reluctant in their recounting of their stories? Had they told this story so often that it just seemed like recounting a childhood memory? Tell us a little bit about that. And then I would like to go in without, for the sake of gore, I would like to go into these horrific incidences and talk about individually but collectively what those many days at sea, marooned at sea, were like.
Mm-hmm. With many of the survivors, there was a wide variety of where they stood on how much they wanted to talk about it. But I feel like every one of them had a canned story, or a story that had told over and over many times. And that story was an important story, but it didn't get into many details. And rightly so. It's, as you have heard, it's an incredibly hard story, and the most tragic thing they lived through. So sharing that was not easy. And so when I first went to my first reunion in 2001, I was, a kid and deer in headlights and so excited, and these were my heroes, and they kind of took me under their wing. But with that, it took time to nurture a relationship, to build trust, for them to understand I genuinely wanted to know. And so over the years, they would open up more and more. And, many of them told me they confided in me. Their families, after they would hear them talking to me, would say, "We've never heard these stories." And I felt like that was such an incredible privilege to be able to, witness those stories through them firsthand, but to also be able to carry them on. And so when they had asked me to be their storyteller, it was just a huge responsibility that I wanted to do right and respectfully. And so I kept bugging them, and I kept showing up, and I kept going to reunions and visiting them at their homes, and just hanging out over the years. And near many of the ends of their lives, what they had asked is they would tell me stories, and they said, prior to this, we didn't want anyone to know. We swore we would never tell this. We all decided we were going to take it with us, but they realized, and this is what they shared, was that they realized if they didn't tell anyone, no one would ever know, that the stories would die with them. And so there were many, many stories about how horrific things got in the water, and the experiences that they personally witnessed, and the losses of their best friends and their shipmates, their brothers. Many of them had served on the ship for as many as 8 years, prior to the war, and then all the way through the war. And they lost those buddies. And so they told these horrific stories, and they said, "We're okay. We want you to share them now." And I think with that, it was kind of therapy for them in some ways, that they finally relieved that burden. And it was a privilege to be able to share those stories.
Lynn?
I was just going to share some of the things that they shared along the lines of what you asked about the time in the water. So it was really interesting, because when the sun came up on the first day, a lot of people were very optimistic. They were like, well, we know it's going to take 12 or 18 hours for the rescue ships to get here, but we're pretty sure a distress signal got off. So, we're very optimistic. We know that we're going to get rescued. And what they didn't know was what I told you, that no rescue signal had been received at any shore station or any station afloat. So that first morning, the thing that Indianapolis is most famous for showed up. the sharks. And we've talked to some shark experts, and what's interesting is that the population of sharks in the Philippine Sea was exponentially greater in 1945 than it is now. Also, the water was warm, about 80 degrees, and they said that they could see 50 feet straight down before the water became opaque. And so when the sharks started coming, it wasn't just dozens or scores, it was hundreds of sharks. And the men said that they could look down 50 feet into the water and see them circling like this, predator squadron underneath their legs. And was it on that day, Sara, that they first struck, or was it the next day? So I don't want to get my details wrong. So, a couple of the shark attack stories that stand out to me, the gentleman in the book trailer who said, "I saw the flag raised at Mount Suribachi," that's L.D. Cox. L.D. Cox was in the water and he was floating next to a buddy. And he said a shark came barreling up from underneath the water and snatched his buddy down, straight down. And it was so close that a wave, like a wave at the beach, broke over LD. That's how close it was. So I can't even imagine the terror of that moment. And then another story that stands out to Sara and I both was by a man named Eugene Morgan, who is also happened to be in the trailer. He said he was on a floater net, and another floater net about 100 yards away had about 10 or 12 sailors on it. And he said suddenly a whole swarm of sharks just attacked it, and it was just fins and foam and screams. And within a few seconds, there was nothing left. And so those are just two of the shark stories that happen over and over and over again. I can't even imagine the terror. But the sharks weren't the only thing that took lives. Another thing that took lives was as the men were out there exposed to the elements, to the sun and to the sea, they began to be really thirsty. And the mind begins to do terrible things. And the mind begins to say, well, you don't need to be thirsty. You're surrounded by water. And a lot of the men knew, don't drink salt water because it causes a condition called hypernatremia. But after several days in that baking sun of the South Pacific, the men would begin to hallucinate, and they would begin to think, this water is just like a clear mountain stream. I'm going to go ahead and take a drink. And so those men who did that, they went insane. Their part of hypernatremia is that your brain shorts out. They, not to be graphic, but they vomited and foamed at the mouth. They became crazy and they died very, very painful deaths.
I want to have about 5 more minutes, and we sort of joked yesterday that we're trying to tell a 13-year history in 45 minutes or so. But please tell us about the rescue and then the 5-decade campaign for vindication, exoneration of Captain McVeigh, who you all make a very clear case he was scapegoated for this.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the parts of the story that is actually one of our favorite parts of the story is the rescue. We were able to interview quite a few of the rescue crew involved, and it was actually a miracle or luck, however you want to look at it, but no one was out looking for them. They were missing. They had seen many, many planes fly by over the days. No one spotted them. It was next to impossible from that elevation for a plane to see heads in the water. And so on that 4th day, they'd survived now 5 nights in the water, and they were as close to death as you could probably possibly be without dying. And that's when a pilot by the name of Chuck Gwynn was flying over them. He was on a routine patrol, and he was testing out a new antenna, and the antenna kept having problems that day. It kept breaking off. So, he goes back into the plane, and he goes back to, and he opens, the hatch to look down to, butts with the antenna, and he sees this oil slick. And he jumps up and he runs back to the cockpit, and his crew is kind of wondering what's going on. And he says, look down and you'll see. Well, they see this oil slick but that's an indication of a submarine and an enemy. And so he's telling them, prepare the bombs, we're going to attack, thinking we're attacking Japanese submarines. And he lowers the plane to a lower altitude. And that's when he notices, he described it as seeing, it was like the bumps on a cucumber. And I don't know if you remember, I was telling you about the oil that the engineering department released into the water. Well, this is super, super thick oil that you can only transfer with heat. And so this is covering these survivors, and this is what they're seeing on the water. And he's seeing these bumps. So he goes down even further. And that's when he realizes these are people in the water. He sees them waving, and you saw Edgar in the video, we waved our arms, we prayed, we splashed, and he sees these men and he doesn't know who they are. Indianapolis has not been reported missing. No ships have been reported missing. They don't know if it's an enemy. They don't know if it's American. They don't know who it is. They just see men in the water, and he starts doing these patrols. And, he calls in ducks on the pond, not knowing who they are. But when he's doing his patrols, he's noticing that there are hundreds of men in the water, and they're spread out over 25 miles. And so the planes start arriving eventually. He's calling in for support, but again, the closest land is about 280 miles away. So it will take ships 12 more hours to arrive before they can even come there and start rescue operations. So when other planes start arriving, they're witnessing this, and they're kind of touring the area to see where they can drop supplies, where they're needed the most, where they can drop rafts and water and canteens and whatnot. And a pilot by the name of Adrian Marks arrives, and Adrian sees what's going on, and his crew sees what's going on. And right before him, he's watching men being taken by sharks. And he said he couldn't just watch, he had to do something. And so, defying protocol, he decides to land his PBY-5A Catalina. And, we can talk about this in a moment, but Lynn and I were able to see a PBY Catalina this week, and it was nothing short of miraculous how he landed that plane in the 15-foot swells in an open ocean. These planes were meant for almost like lake water landings. So for him to do this and to fight those waves and to put his crew at risk was very heroic and very risky and against protocol. But he decided he was going to do this, and he landed, and he successfully rescued 53 men from the water. And he put them everywhere in that plane, including up on the wings, where he tied the men to the wings and with parachute cord until the ships could arrive. And so over the hours, he's trying to taxi around and bring as many men as he can, and there's still men in the water. And that's when, 12 hours later, just after midnight again, that's when the ships start arriving on the scene and start picking up men. And by the time rescue is said and done, there were 320 men who were rescued from the water alive. And sadly and tragically, 4 more passed away before they were able to, receive proper treatment. So the casualties were 879 men, and 316 survived.
And as I mentioned, the blaming, the head rolling started pretty soon. One of the veterans referenced there should have been other heads before they got to the captain. Please tell us about McVeigh. I think many of the viewers know his story, but share that with those who are not as familiar. And what was the court-martial? What was the main argument, and who were the witnesses against him?
Well, Captain McVeigh would later say that he knew, even when he was marooned in the middle of the Philippine Sea, that the Navy was going to try to hang this thing around his neck. And very quickly, he was proven right. They end up charging him. They fished around for something to charge him with, and we document this in the book. They finally charged him with negligence for hazarding his ship and failure to put out a timely abandoned ship call. At the court-martial, they quickly proved that the abandoned ship call was passed man to man because the communications were down. But they did ultimately convict Captain McVeigh for negligence for failing to zigzag. But zigzag was discretionary. So according to the intelligence that he had, which I shared earlier, he didn't think that there was any risk. But they decided to convict him on that anyway. Pretty quickly after that conviction, McVeigh began to receive hate mail. The Navy had now officially pinned it on him. And so the families of the lost at sea began sending him letters. And they would arrive on the anniversary of the sinking, on the birthday of the loved one, Christmas, and different holidays. And the letters would say things like, if it weren't for you, my husband would still be alive. Or if it weren't for you, my daughter would have a father. And so these letters came and came and came, and they continued coming all the way until 1968. And in 1968, according to his sons, McVeigh's sons, he couldn't take it anymore, and he put a gun to his head and shot himself to death. So that was tragic. But to a man, his crew believed he was innocent for some of the reasons that I've already said. The lack of intelligence. And we know from the court-martial documents that there were many other people who knew that there were submarines in the water and that were a threat to Indianapolis, but they failed through negligence to pass that information to Captain McVeigh. And so we lay that out pretty clearly in the book, where it shows that, as the gentleman said in the video, a lot of heads should have rolled before they ever got to the captain. So for the next 50 years, the crew fought to exonerate Captain McVeigh. They had their first reunion. The survivors had their first reunion in 1960 in the city of Indianapolis. And that was their goal. They had three goals. They had the goal to build a monument to honor their shipmates who were lost at sea, to exonerate the captain. And I'm blanking on the other one, Sarah. Are you blanking too?
I'm blanking too.
Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Well, 2 out of 3. Huh?
They wanted to form an organization that would keep this story alive after they were all well gone. And so, and they did do that successfully.
Yeah. So then beginning in the late 90s, there was a young man named Hunter Scott, a young kid who began interviewing the survivors, and he did a history fair project, and he won his history fair project. And a congressman named Joe Scarborough, who is now Morning Joe on MSNBC, got wind of the project, and that led to media appearances for Hunter. And he brought a lot of attention to the fact that McVeigh was falsely convicted. And then later, the captain of the namesake submarine, whom I've already mentioned, Captain Bill Tody, worked with Congress. And finally, in 2001, Captain McVeigh was exonerated and held not responsible for the sinking. But of course, that was decades after he had already taken his own life.
Ladies, I'm going to skip my last question or two because I see we have quite a few online, but I want to give you a virtual round of applause before we get to questions. You had, let me see, we've got Matt here who has asked, can you address the inconclusive anti-submarine action involving the destroyer escort USS Harris that occurred on July 28, 29? How was it received? How was it handled by the cruiser's crew? Was this mysterious submarine contact ever determined to be the I-58?
That's a great question. So out ahead of Indianapolis's path extended, about 700 miles away, actually, there was an anti-submarine action. A merchant ship called Wild Hunter reported seeing a periscope in the water. And the Philippine Sea Command sent out what's called a hunter-killer group to go interdict this submarine. Well, there was a huge chase, and that was one of the cool things that we were able to find for the first time in the Library of Congress, were the actual reports, 15 of them, about how the hunter-killer group fired on this enemy submarine. Well, they eventually lost contact with that submarine. The Indianapolis received message traffic, as did Guam and the Philippine Sea, but the track and distance of that Wild Hunter submarine contact was determined by the Indy officers not to be a threat to Indianapolis. And so after the sinking and during the court-martial, some officers actually told the New York Times that that Wild Hunter submarine was the submarine that sank Indianapolis, and accused the captain of, quote, blundering over the top of an enemy submarine. But later, during the court-martial, and I forgot to mention this, that the Navy called Commander Hashimoto over to Washington, D.C. to testify for the prosecution. Hashimoto drew a track on a map, and that track proved not only that the Wild Hunter submarine wasn't the submarine that sank Indianapolis, but that the intelligence that was not given to McVeigh was so bad that not only was there one enemy submarine on his route extended, but there were two when he was told not to worry about anything, that everything was safe.
And as a follow-up to that, I think you probably alluded to the answer, but Arthur wanted to know what happened to the I-58. And obviously if her skipper was there, can you tell us about the I-58's end of war?
The I-58 went on, they actually were afraid that Indianapolis was with other ships. They thought, of course, there's escorts. And so as soon as they fired the torpedoes, very shortly after, they dived down and kind of hid. And then they surfaced an hour later, and that's when they communicated that, they had hit a battleship. They, went on their way. They encountered other ships. Along the way, they were returning to the homeland, and by the time they returned, Japan had surrendered. And so they arrived having sunk this major ship, knowing they sunk this major ship, and to find out their country, their emperor, had surrendered. And so what was interesting is over the years, the daughter and the granddaughter of Commander Hashimoto actually connected with the USS Indianapolis survivors and has started coming to reunions and has become like family members with the crew and their families. And so what Atsuko, the granddaughter of Hashimoto, has told us is that he never thought of the sinking of Indianapolis as a major victory. He never was very prideful about it. He came back to be a losing country. And so he felt very deep regret about how Captain McVeigh was treated. And so this was something he never talked about. And he went on to become a Shinto monk, I believe.
Shinto priest.
And lived a very peaceful life, raised his family, and now Atsuko lives in Chicago with her family and comes to the reunions. And so it was not this glorious victory for him that you might imagine.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to make light of a tragic and serious situation, but I would venture to bet that 90+% of the people that know anything about the Indianapolis comes from the famous movie Jaws. Was Quint, who is the captain of the boat that they're on at the end, Dreyfuss and Roy Schneider, was he based off of a real character, off of a real crew member, or was this just do you know if this was a story that Spielberg wanted to incorporate into his fictional horror movie?
Actually, Spielberg didn't know about it initially. His screenwriter introduced the story to him, and he wrote that monologue. And Spielberg, when they saw Quint deliver it, they said that was the first time they really realized they had something. It wasn't based on any one specific survivor, but what's interesting is there was a survivor by the name of Bob Goss in Florida, who was a longshore fisherman.
Sponge diver.
Okay. And he actually, made a point to kind of hunt sharks. And he was very proud when they would, when he would catch them in his net, that he would make sure they died slowly, is what he would say. And so he was really kind of that shark hunter that was very similar to the Quint character in Jaws. And, if anyone is out, up for Googling If you search his name and you search Jaws, there's several articles where he's quoted talking about that, because his character and who he was very similar to the character of Quint.
So there's a couple quick questions here. You've interviewed, I think, 108 of the veterans. Can you tell us, sadly, how few we have remaining with us?
There are 8 living survivors today.
Out of nearly 1,200 who were on or on July 30th, 1945. And I'd like to interject, there's some exciting news that'll be happening tomorrow with the reunion. Our audience, many of our audience members don't know that Lynn, and even more so Sara, have been very busy this week and the last month in preparations for the 75th anniversary reunion that's taking place virtually this year. But could one of you please tell us about this special honor?
Yes, so as you mentioned, there's the virtual reunion tomorrow, and it's open to the public. Everyone can check in. Just go to the Indianapolis website, which is USSIndianapolis.com, and you can find out more. But one of the most special parts of this virtual reunion is the presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal that the survivors were honored with in 2018, and then they are receiving the medal, or will be receiving the medal shortly. But it's a big deal, and we're excited that even though we can't get together this year for an actual reunion, we can bring this story and each other together as best possible virtually, and do something special to honor not just 75 years, but the Congressional Gold Medal and the recognition that these sailors and Marines deserve.
And if any of you who are listening are interested in attending, one of the cool things is that there are panels where the survivors some of the 8 remaining survivors will be speaking.
Yeah, I certainly encourage all of our viewers to check out that website. Sara, do you want to say that again, the website?
Yes, it's www.ussindianapolis.com.
Great. And though there may be a few competing sessions, I'd be remiss if I didn't let our regular viewers know that tomorrow at 11 o'clock a.m. Central, our curator, Larry DeCures, will be talking about Operation Olympic, the invasion of southern Japan that never happened. Talk about the battle plans to end the war with boots on the ground rather than the atomic bombs. That's at 11, same time, same place. But we've got an important weekend ahead of us with the anniversary and the commemorations and with your reunion. And thank you for letting us be a part of your sort of a prelude to your busy weekend, but also for sharing this important story. As tragic as it is, it's heroic in the same right. And we're delightful that there's still 8 with us. It's a special time, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to having many of you at many of all of our future programs.